When I was asked by organizers to speak in front of you about freedom and Estonia, I took up the challenge to talk about this very interesting topic for my own personal development as a citizen of free and proudly country of Estonia. And let me be very personal with you. In the fall of 1980, I was 11 years old, and I entered the 4th grade. In one lesson, our teacher asked us to write down on small paper whom we want to be when grown up in the future. I was very clear. I knew exactly what to put down there. I wrote ajalooteadlane, that means in Estonian, a historian. I wonder to this day, actually, why and where this foresight came from. Because at that time, in 1980, being 11 years old, I had a very, very distant understanding of what really happened with us in Estonia and generally in history. Broadly speaking, there were two types of families in Estonia during Soviet Russia occupation times. Those that in closed family circles spoke about and kept alive Estonia's past as it was, first being free and then occupied, and those that had been refrained from speaking it out loud for separate and security reasons. My parents, whom I love very much, created a safe environment for me to grow up. So this little man's world was filled with school, studies, yard games with friends and sports, of whom my hometown, Valga, which is located right on the border between Estonia and Latvia, was surrounded by Russian missile bases. At that time, my knowledge about Estonia being under foreign rule was very vague, to say the least. These topics were not discussed at our home, although occasionally the voice of America could be heard on crackling radio waves. And on even rarer occasions, we received dispatches from very distant relatives who had escaped the Soviet rule and lived in Baltimore. The letters, and especially the photos that arrived from the United States at that time, looked like some mysterious messages from another planet. Years later, in summer of 1987, I was allowed to cross the Soviet Union border for the first time in my life as a passenger of so-called youth friendship train from Moscow to Berlin. I was then 17. Looking back, crossing the border from Brest to Poland was like leaving the prison for a brief moment. KGB curators warned the passengers to be especially careful in Poland. We were told that Poland is a dangerous place and is on the wrong track. In East Berlin, I saw the wall with my own eyes, but I couldn't connect the dots yet. Only later, after my trip through Poland to East Germany, when the first waves of protest against the Soviet rule started in Estonia, I began to understand that Estonia is something more than just a place to live. Luckily, I had some good mentors at that point in life who guided me towards the right books, and my interest in history really took off. In the spring of 1988 was truly the spring of my own sense of freedom. From then on, I never looked back. In the same spring, my classmates, and I participated in a local rally for the protection of the environment devastated by Russian troops near my hometown with a slogan, annad kuradile sõrme, võtab terve käe, meaning you give the devil a finger, he takes a whole hand. A few weeks later, one of my classmates brought Estonian flag that had been hidden for half a century to graduation ceremony. It was the first time I saw the real flag of Estonia in my life. Since Estonia wasn't actually free yet, this was still a very rare sight at the time. Filled with keen interest in history and burning desire to contribute to these times of change, I wrote a long article to a local newspaper called Communist on a topic of why we should change the street names that remind us the occupation of my own hometown, Valga. The local KGB crumbled a bit, but after a while the city got back the former street names that had been used when country was free. In September 1988, then already as a member of a local heritage protection society and as a first-year history student, I helped to excavate a monument to the War of Independence in Valga, which the Russians had destroyed twice in 1940s. Fortunately, it had been buried in a hole dug right near the pillar. We restored it as was done with about 170 other freedom monuments across Estonia during those years. However, the highlight for me at that time came on February 24th, 1989. It was the first time in Estonia during 50 years occupation that our Independence Day was openly celebrated across the country. It was on this day that our blue, black and white national flag hoisted again tall Hermann's Tower in our capital, Tallinn. It was also decided to celebrate this day grandly in Valga, where I was still living. As a member of Heritage Society, I was appointed as one of the flag guards during the consecration and hoisting of a flag. Right after the flag ceremony, people gathered in a cultural house where I read the Estonian Independence Manifesto from 1918 at the festive meeting. A large hall filled to the brim with people listening while standing. It was a moment that for a young person was obviously bigger than words could describe. It was a miracle. I remember so vividly those political debates in our dormitory at Tartu University in late 1988. We dreamed big and agreed that maybe Estonia could be or become free again by the change of millennium. We had no idea that a major change in world politics would give Estonia an opportunity to regain its independence already in a few years' time. So when we graduated Tartu University, we graduated as citizens of free republic. But before I started my professional career as a journalist, writing my university thesis gave me another layer of understanding about freedom. During my history studies, my interest turned to Russian history, especially to the area that started after Bolshevik coup in 1917. I wrote my thesis on the topic Red Terror during the Estonian War of Independence in 1918-1919. I was lucky because the first winds of change opened the doors of archives to me. No one had studied these documents before me. Even the KGB archive in Moscow let me in. I was able to establish that just in few months Bolsheviks killed more than 600 people in Estonia, mainly out of class hatred. Many were killed under brutal torture. This was the beginning of terrible crimes against humanity committed by Cheka, better known later as NKVD, KGB, or FSB, that led millions of people to their graves in later decades and for which no one has ever been punished. With this knowledge under my belt and an interest in history, I started my professional career in 1993 as a foreign news editor of Postimees, Estonia's largest daily newspaper. Just a few weeks after that, I made my first business trips to Moscow, to Russia, to Ukraine, and a little later, I became a newspaper's first foreign correspondent in Moscow. In October 1993, I witnessed a coup attempt in Moscow. Communists and fascists together were the puppets of the secret services who tried to shake Russia off its pro-Western course. This was the first time I had serious doubts about the future of democracy in Russia. Demonstrations of communists and patriots in the streets of Moscow, like this one here in 1995, seemed like shadow of the past. But in fact, they predicted the future. And then came the war in Chechnya. I had never been to the Caucasus before. The war introduced me to the Highlanders, who had their very strong own sense of freedom. Chechens wanted freedom. Their desire for freedom was so much like us, like ours. After all, their president, General Johar Dudaev, was in Tartu in 1991 in Estonia as a commander of Soviet airfield of strategic bombers. He was remembered among Estonians very positively because he refused to use force against us. When I met Dudaev in February 1995, he was convinced that the Russian Empire would wage the war for its existence for a long time to come. He talked about Crimea, Ukraine, and 50 more years. I was hesitant, but not anymore today. He was right. Chechens' brave fight against an overwhelming force ended dramatically. Destroyed cities and villages, tens of thousands of dead, and shattered lives. The Chechen wars marked the definitive end of democratic reforms and the rise of FSB, the successor of KGB, that had unleashed the war in Russia. After the 1999 apartment building bombings organized by FSB, terror once again openly became a tool of Russian state power to achieve its domestic and foreign policy goals, and the empire launched a massive counterattack. In 2001, Russian journalist Anna Politkovskaya wrote these prophetic sentences. In our country, extrajudicial executions are taking place like on the line. There are already thousands of victims of a new year, 1937. We reassure ourselves that for the time being it is only the year 1937 in Chechnya, after all. They will not reach us. It is wrong and frivolous to think so. In a country, a misanthropic ideology prevails. 5 years later, on Putin's birthday, Anna Politkovskaya was killed. In 2003, I was elected to Estonian parliament for the first time. As then, so right now I am chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. I am lucky because I can combine work with a hobby even as a politician. But it is also a big responsibility. We can never be relaxed until we have such neighbor as the imperially sick Russia. This is why Estonia is passionately rallying for a strong and proactive Western alliance. This is why we are united to support Ukraine in their war of independence. It was in January 2014 when I spent few hours in the heart of Revolution of Dignity on the Maidan in Kiev. I will never forget the feeling of unwavering willingness of Ukrainians from all over the country to sacrifice their lives for freedom in the center of Kiev. When I asked the people standing at the barricades in the minus 30-degree frost, what are you out here for? The answer was quick. We want to be free to decide our own future as you, Estonians. It was the real moment of birth of Ukraine as a modern democratic state and society. The freedom won with the blood of dozens of brave people directed the country on a course that will change the whole Europe and perhaps even the world. Russia launched a war of aggression to destroy Ukraine as a country on February 20th, 2014, when it started occupying Crimea. Tens of thousands of people have died since then. In 8 years, I went to frontline in eastern Ukraine 4 times. And each time I wondered how we in the West do not notice the approach of a great disaster. The forgotten war caught many of us by surprise on February 24 this year. Russia was continued its desperate attempt to tear down the veil of freedom in the territories of former empire and restore the Russian world in its evil. They were able to occupy a fifth of territory of Ukraine, but they have not been able to bring the people fighting for the survival of a country and nation to their knees. Ukraine must win this war if we want to avoid global catastrophe. For those who value freedom, there is no other choice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mihkelson. Let's see if we might have time for a quick question from the audience. I know that Mr. Mihkelson is on the way to the airport in a moment, so yes, we'll have to do a short one. Do we have anybody willing to volunteer?
Okay, we have a volunteer. Please pass the microphone. Thank you.
Thank you very much for this amazing speech. It is truly inspiring, and it's amazing to see your hard work in all of these years for freedom. I would like to ask a quick question regarding Estonia's history and its independence movement. Me as a Romanian, being very interested in our brothers in Moldova, what can we learn from your lesson? How can we bring freedom to Moldova and bring it closer to our home nation and Europe also? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. This is a very challenging question to me, and to give advice to you is perhaps not the right thing to do. But we learned our lesson from our history during World War II. Very painful, very tragic lesson. We were a neutral country in late 1930s. And we really, that time, our leaders really hoped that being neutral means that catastrophe around the world and in the world during World War II times won't touch us. Of course, we were wrong that time. And that gave us, as politicians today in Estonia, but also for general society, clear understanding that we should never be alone again. This is why a small country like Estonia has been extremely active and proactive in terms of building alliances and partnership within Western world, like EU, NATO membership. We became members of those organizations in 2004. But also at the same time, you must understand that this kind of dynamics from our history, being when we were occupied for 50 years, being in prison of his Soviet empire, actually unleashed this kind of DNA, mysterious DNA in our blood, the Estonian blood, where we are never happy enough what we have achieved. We always look forward to the future. And perhaps this has been one of the reasons why Estonia has been so successful being in modernization and digitalization, also for those who have put together companies who now are unicorns. We have more than 10 unicorns in Estonia currently, and this is something what also has its roots in those very traumatic and drastic times in our past. But never give up and dream big. And I'm more than sure that Moldova will be part of Europe and European Union in the future.
I might, in that case, come with another quick question from one of our students. Just as Moldova and Romania has a special relationship, so does Estonia and Finland. And we have here a question whether Estonia can serve as the bridge to Finland for the 3Cs initiative. Can we somehow attract our northern neighbors a little bit more to this form of cooperation? They are joining other multilateral organizations as we speak.
In those, actually this year has been much wider Zeitenwende, as Julian earlier talked about. It is Zeitenwende for entire Europe and also Zeitenwende for Finland, because what will happen in coming weeks, perhaps in months, hopefully Hungary and Turkey will ratify soon accession protocols of Finland and Sweden for NATO. This is going to be a dramatic strategic change in our part of the world, in Northern Europe. And I think that this will allow also for Finland and Sweden to open up for all those discussions as well we had today here during this conference, but we have as countries of Central Eastern Europe in terms of geopolitics, security, and the importance to cooperate among our nations. I will fly tonight to Finland. I will take this message with me.
Thank you very much, sir. That was a pleasure to host you here.
Thank
Mr.
you.
Marko Mihkelson, Estonia, Chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and Estonian, a member of the Parliament.